And we're live.
Welcome back to the Ops Show, where we bring you the trials and tribulations, the automations and collaborations from the world of DevOps and the greater developer experience. I'm your host, Tristan Pollock, and as always with CTO.ai founder, Kyle Campbell. In our best show yet, we have Emily Freeman, a software engineer, author of DevOps for Dummies, principal cloud advocate at Microsoft, and a self-proclaimed human router.
Wow, I sound fancier than I actually am. That's cool.
I like the human router
Welcome
one,
to the show.
I really cling to the human router thing. That's how I think of myself. I think it's the perfect analogy because I make connections between people.
Love it.
Yeah, I love that. I honestly wish I would have thought of it sooner. Well, welcome. So great to have you here. Give us a little bit of background on your, your kind of code story, right? Like, how did start at the beginning? Like, how did you get into code originally?
Yeah, so I was born in Fairfax, Virginia. I'm kidding.
Well,
but yeah, yes, I grew up in the swamp, as our president refers to it. But originally, I was not in tech, so I went to school for political science. I love politics, or did for a while, and then I ended up working in PR, which is interesting, but learned how to write, and then kind of like went through this phase. I call it like my multi-career experimental phase, where it's like I just couldn't find what I wanted to do. I felt a lot like a truck in mud. Like I kept putting energy in, but I was just churning. Like I wasn't getting any traction. So I did I fundraised for nonprofits. I did odd jobs. And at some point, an old PR friend asked me if I'd be interested in editing a self-published book by one of her friends. I was like, I mean, sure, okay, fine. I was trying to pay off my student loans. So I'm like, sure, money, cool. And so I got into editing, and after a while of doing that, people started asking me to write for them. So that's where Editing Emily comes from, my Twitter handle. That was my company for a long time. And then I had my daughter. My marriage was falling apart, and I was like, fuck, I need a change. Like, this is not working. Writers don't make a ton of money. I know that's shocking to everyone. I was like, I need like an actual career, like a tangible skill, right? I left college, like a humanities degree. We leave school and it's like, you have lots of skills, but it's not like this tangible thing of like, I'm an accountant, or I'm, whatever, a lawyer, whatever it is. So I went on a hunt for that, and I was like, okay, well, how hard can coding actually be? I mean, the hubris of that, by the way.
Love it. Famous last words.
I know. So I went to this meetup, Arlington Ruby. I owe them so much, in Arlington, Virginia. And they helped me out, and they ran this conference, and it was open to beginners. So I was like, oh, that's me. That's perfect. And I show up. They thought I was like new to Ruby, not programming.
Everything.
So they're like, oh, you know nothing. Okay, all right, I'm pivoting. But after a while, I like sort of self-teaching, and I'm not someone who's super self-motivated. Like I do need someone who's like a little bit Catholic guilting me in my behind my back. So I thought, okay, I'll go to a code school in DC. Maybe I'll commute to New York, like stay on the East Coast, because I am very East Coast. But the folks at Arlington Ruby were like, you got to go to Denver. And I was like, why would I go to Denver? What? And they're like, no, that's the best code school if you're serious about this. I was like, okay,
Which
all
code
right,
school?
let's do it. So it was Turing here in Denver. And the guy who runs it he started with Hungry Academy, which was a living social program. So it's evolved over the years. But it's a good program. It's a longer program than most. So it's 7 months rather than 12 weeks. Yeah. So I packed my daughter in the car. She's 6 months old at the time. I show up, and I was still nursing, so I need a place to pump, right? So like I show up at this school, and it's a total open format. Like there's no room, like no actual closed door rooms outside of the bathrooms and this electrical closet. So I'm like, sure. So
pivoting. You're pivoting again. Pivoting.
I know, exactly. It's like, whatever, let's just keep the train moving. It's fine. It was very funny because I had the circuit breaker. So if anyone like blew a fuse, they'd be like, Emily, can you flip the switch? Sure. I got the microwaves working again. Hang on. But yeah, I made it through code school. I focused on Ruby. And then I got out and I had a freak out because I was like, I need a job. I don't have a CS degree. Who is going to hire me? And honestly, at that point, I felt like my writing experience was a bit of a waste, right? Like it was like, what if you took 10 years of your life and it added up to nothing? Like it's just a really sinking feeling, like, ugh. But I was like, it's okay. We're making changes. It's fine. So I really busted my butt. Like I knocked on every door and I was like, hi, I'm Emily. Would you like to hire me? I'm very enthusiastic. And it worked. So I got a role and it was in Java of all languages.
Ooh.
So the interview process was very interesting because I was my biggest detractor. I'm like, just so we're clear again, I do not know Java. Like, are we good? You're going to pay me to learn a language I don't know. This is a very interesting industry.
This happened for me once, but they confused Java and JavaScript, and they weren't so open to me learning Java because they thought I already learned it. So, yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I have deep concerns about that company though.
Yes.
If they're...
I left the same day. I was like,
I know.
I'm
You're
out.
like, bye-bye. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I did that. And then I enjoy software development, but the passion for me comes from creating something out of nothing. Like the creation process is what's exciting to me. The actual like coding isn't necessarily what makes my heart, beat faster. I know that is for a lot of people and I love that. But for me, it's like creating something. And so I knew I didn't want to like sling code for the rest of my life. I was like, this is not my biggest value add. And so I started speaking, and it sort of started by, I had this like awful ops team. Like we were very traditional engineering org, like very siloed. And so it was just this back and forth. And I finally had it. And I went and like angry typed this abstract for Humpty Dumpty, a story of DevOps gone wrong. And that just sort of like kicked everything off. It's like, they liked the talk, a couple conferences. I loved speaking. And then someone was like, there's this role called developer advocacy. I was like, that sounds like something I would like.
Perfect.
And I've been doing it ever since.
I've only known you for 15 minutes, and I'm like, just hearing this story, I'm like, that's your calling right there.
Exactly. Yeah. It's this wonderful melding of like my skill set and my passions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there you go. Wow. That's such an awesome story.
Thank you.
Yeah, like not to compare stories, but I have a similar process where I went through and learned it. Obviously, I don't think I came through any of the challenges or took necessarily the same risks you did. Moving across the country with a 6-month-old, putting it all into there, just figuring it out. The enthusiasm is amazing. That's so great.
Yeah.
What's your sort of, like looking back at boot camp? This is something I'm curious to understand. We have some boot camps here. Showed at Lighthouse Labs, which we've been very involved in. I hired a lot of people out of there in the past. Because everybody's really smart, tenacious, enthusiastic, and good self-directed learners, right? So there's a lot of real good benefits of that. But looking back, that's sort of like one of the 12-week courses. You did the 7-month course. What are your thoughts on sort of the different styles of learning in that accelerated fashion?
Yeah, I think it has to do with sort of where you're coming from, like what knowledge base you're starting with, right? So I've definitely known some people, some of them have CS degrees, but other folks who maybe come from like a science, or they did a little bit of CS in college, maybe didn't get a degree, or maybe they are actually developing in a job because they're self-taught, but they want a little bit more, I guess, meat on their resume sort of thing.
Yeah.
And to feel more confident. We all struggle with imposter syndrome.
Of course.
So I think if you're starting from that point, a 12-week, 3-month program is perfectly acceptable. Like you're going to, because you have that context in your brain and you can kind of attach different things to the hooks you already have in your head of how it all works, you kind of learn faster. For me, like I knew nothing. Like I cannot emphasize further. I had never gamed. I had never done anything near it. I've like moved things around in HTML and CSS, but very basic, and Z index, like all over the place. It was not good. So starting from zero, I think it's really important to have, someone who like sets that foundation, because it's not just about learning a language, because that's more about the syntax, but it's how does the program or the computer actually interpret a program? Like, how does it work? And that's what I needed to learn for the first few weeks.
Yeah. One of my experiences that I look back on, I mean, I think I was programming kind of by myself, teaching myself from a very early age. And I look back and I think that people that could go through, like, let's say a 6-month boot camp, they would learn more in 6 months now than I learned over 6 years. And it was only once I started working with other people and understanding like actually how they think that I was actually became like a competent developer in any shape or form. Everything else was just a mess. And in retrospect, I'm always very curious about that accelerated learning style and how it's a spectrum. I think the strongest people I've ever seen are people who will go do a computer science degree and then actually do like a boot camp afterwards. Because they learn the sort of theoretical, but also the very practical. But I think even if you were just to start with one, most boot camps give you such a great lift. And it's a question to me because I've usually seen the 12-week ones opposed to the 7. So that's good. I mean, I think that's really good feedback for people. What about your book? Tell us about your book. Where did that come into your story?
I mean, so I wrote DevOps for Dummies. The
is it like an official for Dummies brand one too?
I know.
Is it?
Yeah.
Nice.
Wiley was very good to me. They did awesome things. Like, I was very big on the singular they. I was like, I need to be able to use singular they. Can we make that happen? And they completely, met me in that. So they were an awesome partner. But yeah, I wrote the book. I had I knew I wanted to write a book at some point. And I'm big on, you could look at it with vision boarding, but that feels very Boulder, Colorado, which, I'm close to, so it's fine. But it's like, you do kind of have to put things into the universe, and maybe it's not just for them, but more like you, like you sort of setting expectations for you, like, hey, I want this, and I want it so much that I'm going to verbalize it. And so I had sort of put that out for a while, but I didn't expect like an opportunity to come quickly, and then it did, because the universe occasionally is a very beautiful place. I know. They hadn't had any kind of DevOps book, and they're like, we know that this is a gap in our publications, so are you interested? And I was like, yes. They're like, okay. I'm like, okay, let's do this. And so again, hubris. I was like, oh, like 6 months, no big deal. No. Writing a book is really, really hard.
What was the process? Like, walk us through that.
Yeah. I mean, so much drinking and sobbing and feeling.
Non-stop cigarettes.
That's right. Totally. If I smoked, I would have been like just chain smoking. I lived above a bar at the time. And I would go down there, and I had this seat that I really liked at the bar because it was near the outlet. There's like the one power outlet near the bar. So I go down with my laptop and like get a drink and write. And so like after like 3 months, someone came up to me. They're like, hey, so like, what are you doing? And I'm like, what do you mean? They're like, well, you started showing up here and you like sit in your hoodie and you drink a lot and you type on your computer. We're just wondering what you're doing. Like, it does look a little insane. But yeah, it just sort of, you start with a plan. So, in the book proposal, you have to submit a table of contents. And that's used as sort of like almost scaffolding, because it does change. And it's a very interesting creative process. Like, anytime you're creating something, you start out and you're like, okay, there's usually, so for me, I don't know if it's everyone, but for me, there was like a hemming and hawing at the beginning. Like, I don't know what to say about this. What am I possibly going to say about CI/CD or whatever? Like, how do you start to explain it? And then you kind of like throw up some words onto a page. You're like, this is shitty. And then, if you get to like page 3 though, of that shitty writing, you actually find like a footing. And there is this, there's this process, and different creative people like have described it in 1,000 different ways, but my father writes, and he describes it as like catching fire. And it's where the sort of thing that you want to build sort of meets you and decides what it wants to be. And it's right around that like page count that you're like, wait, I could write a whole book about this. How am I going to limit it to 10 pages?
Yeah. I've heard the process leading up to that they call it resistance. I forget who the author was who talks about it. It was this idea of resistance, and the professional goes to work and they just keep grinding even if they're not going to get there. And eventually you break through the resistance, and then you come up the other side, and it sounds like it's the catch fire. I just heard that.
That is a perfect word.
It's a Joe Rogan moment or something on YouTube that I heard about this, and some inspirational talk. So I don't know.
I love it.
Yeah.
No, resistance is a perfect description, because it is. You're just like dragging yourself through the work.
Yeah.
And then it finally gets something.
Yeah. So how did you explain it? What does the book cover? What is the sort of synopsis, and how do we unpack some of the interesting insight that people could learn from it if they were to go pick it up and read it?
Yeah. So the blessing and sort of curse of a Dummies book is it's literally meant for someone who knows nothing to pick it up and be able to really walk away with some basic knowledge. And it's sort of like a foundation to help you figure out what you don't know. Almost, like, what do you need to go learn more about? And so it was an interesting experience, because like at that point, like tech in general is such a fascinating industry, in that one of the major characteristics is that we're constantly trying to impress each other. It's like, look how smart I am. And we use a bunch of jargon and like big words. And the minute someone says something that we're not sure of, like the thought of asking, what do you mean, is so scary. Like, it's just like, and so it was trying to back up, like my editor, Susan, bless her, because she's mean, but she did a good job. I hated her for a period of time, but now I appreciate her. But she was like, so for example, it would be like, if you spin up a server, she's like, what is spinning up? I'm like, well, I don't know. How do you explain spinning? Like, turn it on. I don't like. And so really stepping back and thinking about all the ways we describe very simple things in these very complex manners was tricky. But I decided I needed to write it for someone, because you have to kind of picture someone in your mind. And my mom was only going to carry me so far. So I was like, okay, who am I writing this for? And I pictured like a CIO in Hartford, Connecticut, who worked at an insurance company. And, what would they need? They have decades of legacy code bases. They have incredible security and compliance issues to consider. And so how do you take that person and pitch this concept of like microservices and, continuous deployment? Like, that's very scary. And so I kind of kept that person in my mind. And then I really just kind of wanted to focus on the people, process, and tooling, in that order. So the tooling section of this book, very small.
I love that.
So I just really wanted to focus on like, hey, it's about relationships. It's about trust. It's about persuasion, experimentation. And then finally, like figuring out a quick feedback loop for your, centering your customer to make sure that you're keeping them in mind for all your decisions.
I love that. I mean, we have lots of things we say about this: people, process, immortalized in tools, right? Like, you're trying to create leverage for people. The 10x engineers are 5 times more productive for 2 people, or the opposite, 2 times more productive for 5, however you want to do the math. We always have thought about tools as last, and I think that's one of the driving contrarian viewpoints. I would really agree with you, and probably insightful as you zoomed out and just looked at all the jargon, where it's like, how are we actually enabling people to do good work? And one of our hypotheses is that there's a real huge broken feedback loop between the business, or let's say that CIO, and the work that people are doing on the floor. And so part of it is, in our minds, how do we bring down the cost of building tools, but then also instrument them so that feedback loop is starting to be built in through, as you would know, like these metrics, DORA metrics, things like this that are ultimately like a better measurement both for the developers but also for the business, of saying like, hey, here's what success looks like for us if we bring down our mean time to recovery, right? What's sort of some of the feedback that you've gotten on that position as people have read the book and as they've sort of absorbed these concepts? Is that still hard for that sort of CIO persona to kind of get through, or do they come out of that book going, okay, now I've got a framework for understanding this through that? Because that's a contrarian lens, I would think, for many of them, right?
Yeah, I think it's contrarian. I think, though, it's a sort of party line we've been talking about for a decade. Like, can you believe DevOps is like 10 years old? That is wild to me.
We need a new term for
almost
it.
11. Yeah, I know. Well, it'll happen at some point. Because like DevOps, you can look at DevOps as like the progression from Agile, and now it's like, yeah, it's SRE-ish. We'll get there. We should come up with that. We'll become millionaires, probably not.
Billionaires.
Yeah, no, everyone that reads the book loves it. No criticism whatsoever.
Okay, so now I gotta ask, what's the criticism?
That's great.
Where does the let's go with criticism and then all the accolades.
I like it. For the biggest criticism was typos, actually, and I totally agree. I know, and I'm like, because you look at the thing for a year and then you pass it on, and honestly, by the time editing rolled around, I was like, you know what, ship it. I don't give a shit. I'm done.
That's very DevOps of you. That's very DevOps of you.
Yeah, exactly. Just, ship it. We'll see what happens. But yeah, like I'm like, this had an editor, but as soon as you open up and you see a typo, you're like, oh, no.
Were these from like these jargony technology terms like Kubernetes, or like was this more just like your average typo, like in
no, just
English?
little typo, little repetitions, just truly typos. Things that just didn't get caught, no matter how many eyes were looking at it. I think with like how people perceive it, it really depends on their personal experience and sort of where they're at on their journey. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, well, have you experienced these pain points? Most of us have. I think sometimes leadership, like a lot of times the people that reach out to me are like, the head of engineering who's like hitting snags, talking to the, I don't know, the CEO or something. Like it's depending on where they kind of hit their resistance. Mm-hmm. And they're like, can you come convince this person? And I'm like, sure. But also you could too. Like, here's how to do it. So yeah, I think it comes down to like, have you experienced these pain points, and have you realized that the sort of contrarian views that we're bringing up, it's not because we're, this pie in the sky concept. It's because it works. It's because we have seen actual companies, accelerate their development, make more money, reduce costs by implementing this sort of a little bit different way of looking at something.
Yeah, what I think is interesting about that is I think we've also seen the opposite. And I think that's never been more true in my career, where technology and tools are getting in the way of real tangible business value. And I think there's this layer of like subjectivity or mistrust that erodes the core concepts of what you're trying to communicate there, where suddenly the business and that broken feedback loop that I always come back to stop to trust the technology decisions, or the technology decisions become too abstract from what the business is actually looking to deliver. Yep. And one of the things that is like a burning question for me, which is something I always see, is you sort of have these people who are super proficient in DevOps, especially the technology aspect of it. And bringing them back into this beginner's mind, have you experienced anyone who went from sort of like, I'm an expert at DevOps, back to this beginner's mind? And what was their thought process? Was like, hey, this is too oversimplified, or was it enlightening for them to start from the beginning and reevaluate their context?
I think anytime that happens, it usually has to do with the same way any of us change our mind, which is someone they know and care about is struggling. Right. And then they start to see it through someone else's eyes, because knowledge bias is a thing. Like, we can't even help ourselves. Once you know something, you can't unknow it. Yeah. And I know that sounds obvious, but it's like, when we apply it to our everyday lives, and it's like the way you talk about things, it just becomes natural to you, but still very foreign to someone else. And squaring that, making that connection again, it's hard. I actually think if you have a good environment, and you're willing to invest in them and mentor them, this is one of the areas where junior engineers are incredibly powerful, because they ask the questions that seniors and principals just wouldn't ask. Yeah. Because either they're afraid to ask them, which happens, or they don't even think about it, And it's that sort of like, I like to call it IaaS, idiot as a service. It's like, ask the dumb questions, let's address them, because turns out they're not stupid a lot of times. Like, they're actual things.
Very practical,
and they can help you. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And much more empathetic to the customer typically. Yeah, the naivety can be real. It's the same way as in startups, right? Yeah. Like, sometimes they say, like, I never would have built that if I wasn't naive enough to think it would work. In entrepreneurship, I think there's a very similar approach in software engineering too, where most junior engineers I've
I've ever worked with just don't know that they're doing it wrong, and that's a good thing because they learn how to do it wrong and then they figure out quickly how to do it right, where the knowledge bias is there's this pressure to do it right, you know. And beginner's mindset is really important. I think it's just sometimes challenging, I think, to incorporate those ideas into a mature DevOps organization. And once that flywheel starts turning and you have DevOps for DevOps and CI/CD servers and more things to manage, have you seen that sort of go the opposite way? And what do you think is sort of like the negative correlation of adopting these practices that you've seen for different businesses?
Of adopting DevOps practices?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of DevOps practices that don't get implemented. I guess people process tools. Maybe they get implemented in the opposite way. What's sort of some of the things that you, I mean, especially in your principal, in your role at, Advocate, I'm sure you talk to tons of these companies, right?
Yes.
What are some of the challenges that you see as they go through and they actually adopt more and more DevOps? Is there a diminishing return at some point?
Yeah, I think the big catch, the big sort of gotchas are going to be people who jump right to the tooling because we're engineers. Like that's it's like, oh, I can build this. I can solve this. I can build it. The problem is you're building it for you, not everyone else. Like that's, you have to go figure out what everyone needs and then we can actually build a tool. But I firmly believe that tools don't solve problems. They reduce toil. And you have to solve a problem manually through a process before you can ever automate it. Otherwise, you're just automating your problems right into your pipeline. You're just going to get to a bad time faster. So yeah, I think jumping to tooling and then, not inviting everyone to the table. I think when you make assumptions about the problem that we need to solve, because a lot of times, like, more often than not, I think the problem that gets presented as the thing we need to solve isn't actually the problem. And so you have to like dig in. It's like, okay, well, what is the outcome you actually want from this? Because that's the action that we need to address. And in order to really get into the meat of that, you have to have everyone at the table. And that includes like, not just the people we talk about a lot, like security and testing and all of these things, but like, where's your sales and marketing teams? Because they're going to have to be drumming up support for these products or these launches. They're going to be expecting, launch dates, and they need to have a clear understanding of like what the value is for whatever it is, so they can message it. And so having that sort of continuity of communication is really key. Yeah.
The one most important question I try to ask companies, stakeholders, especially non-technical stakeholders, like, how do you measure the success of engineering? Like, what's your interpretation of what that means? And let's start there. And if you don't know, that's fine. Like, we can establish something. But it's almost always, I hear two things. One, I want delivered on time, and I want it to be broken less. And to me, that's where things like DORA metrics, I think, are great, because the first two metrics, lead time or change to whatever, hey, it isn't delivering on time. And then how often is it breaking? How quickly are we fixed? I mean, to me, those are great starting points. Have you seen other ways of measuring this in a way that's cross-functional for broader cohorts of people who are being brought to the table? Because I know a lot of it is just communicative, but as engineers, we want things to be more objective, I think, a lot of times, right? And I think 100%. Having some of that objective feedback loop built in to the tools is the thing that we're really trying to push in our thinking. And it's why we spend so much time talking about like the developer workflow, the developer experience, because we think you have to instrument that experience for consistency, and there's a broad stakeholder group. So I mean, what have you seen? What are your thoughts on measurement in DevOps?
Yeah, I mean, it gets tricky, right? Because you can have the classic ones, but it's the reason I get a little, itchy about measuring is, though measurements are important, it becomes a sort of checklist for people. And it's like, oh, well, we reduced this, therefore we're winning. Or, we have a pipeline, therefore we're DevOpsing. It's like, no, there's always, room for improvement. And a lot of times, like, the issues you said earlier, like tech and tooling can get in the way. And I completely agree. Like, this is my whole thesis, that the sort of problems we're facing as an industry right now are human problems. And because we're humans, we code our problems into our tooling. So it's like really kind of addressing those issues. So all of the data is really important, but it kind of just, it roots a broader richer story of this is how, you know, the engineering team is approaching something with a, you know, customer centric approach, or this is how we've reduced the silo and we're communicating and we're working together on this or whatever. The one sort of tool I have seen work that I think spans across all the organizations within a company is really feature flags. Like, I love feature flags from a sales and marketing perspective, because it takes the weight off of, well, we need to launch it and it needs to be bug free on this exact day. Like, that is stressful as fuck. So how do you take that away? Oh, well, it's already launched. You get to flip that flag on the day that you want.
I like it. You get to press the big red button, sales team.
Yes. Yes. And it really reduces that friction, because if someone's breathing down your neck, I mean, like, for me, I don't like that person. It's like, back up. I'm doing the best I can. And then for someone else who like consistently looks at engineers and they're like, they just don't deliver on time, I can totally see that perspective too. Yeah. So finding those sort of compromises in a way is powerful.
Yeah, I think it's about finding a middle ground to have a conversation that is not so subjective from different points of view, and there's different ways, I think, of doing that. What I like about feature flagging is it creates this nice safety net for the engineers to kind of work at their pace and let the business kind of flag it on when they need to put it live. So that's a big one. I like that one a lot.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you all work with like startups and enterprises? Like, how does it change based on?
Yeah, of course.
I'm very much in an enterprise environment right now.
Yeah. So we spend a lot of time with startups, and the story of the business kind of goes back a couple years. First, sort of as a managed kind of DevOps consultancy. And we ran into a lot of these problems with our customers. We ran into a lot of these problems as we grew our own engineering teams. And really what we started to say is like, okay, well, as a team grows, how do you maintain some level of directional alignment? Because we believe there's just like generally a negative correlation of, consistency as you hire more people and create more process. And so how do you sustain that to some degree longer? And at least the things that you've done manually, which you know are working, how do you then immortalize the philosophies and the best practices into certain tools, but like maintain a level of flexibility with those tools and promote this idea of observability, clear communication. And as things went remote, obviously, we really focused on tools, and we focused on tools around the idea of how do we then also bring the developer experience to be more deeply integrated with things like Slack, which promote more of that communication. Maybe not always the best communication, but it's definitely like a place, or even, you brought up Teams earlier. Teams is another place where a lot of this communication happens. So how can we bring the human communication and collaboration loop closer to something where the tools don't have such a high cost of ownership, and they're driving the right facilitation of conversation, which, we don't really have a strong opinion on what productivity or what the right solution is in your organization. But if we can reduce the cost of tools so that you can iterate through whatever that tooling is, and we can drive information into the conversation that you're having, I think that that's a meaningful way for us to try to facilitate it. And so just back up to your original question, during the consulting area, we worked sort of with companies of all sizes, and we saw way different challenges in a large organization, and mostly, to your point, it's like perpetuated by the communication. But in startups, what was interesting, which has been my specialization for a long time, is the tooling is something that I found makes a huge difference, because people tend to require less communication loops. They tend to be able to work more independently. There's a little bit more momentum and context carrying you through, a mission-oriented startup. So tools can be a real driver, but we've also seen a lot of those startups sort of adopt this idea of DevOps, which is often evangelized out of the enterprise or, by the big cloud organizations. And they adopt these practices maybe too earlier. And so this is where we started kind of trying to advocate this idea of lean DevOps, like the lean startup methodology, where it's not about like doing it right. It's about like iterating your tools and your processes to embody the things that you're figuring out, and creating a feedback loop between, the especially the non-technical people. And I think the earlier you do that, the better your context you have as you grow. And data is certainly not the only equation here. Tools are not the only equation, but they essentially provide structure to the things that you're figuring out at the human layer, and then let you amplify them beyond an individual to the 10x model of 5 people, 2 times more, maybe not productive, maybe they have 2 times stronger context. And to me, the ultimate measurement of DevOps boils down to one thing: can you deploy on your first day in the company, right?
Oh, yeah.
And like, how do you learn about that? And what is the way that you build confidence with that? And like, in a startup, this is maybe a little bit aggressive, but it's like, I really want any startup that I ever worked in to be a place where it's like, it's harder for you to fill out your payroll paperwork than it is for you to deploy to production. And if I can like get it to that level of ease of use, then anyone should be enabled as they come in the company and feel confident. And if I can get over that confidence and imposter syndrome quickly, you don't spend 3 months learning all of this, non-commodity technology. You're saying, hey, look, this is quite similar, and I can shift over here and I can shift over here. So, we're still trying to figure out how that hypothesis fits into the larger enterprise, because there's a lot more DevOps that you sort of have to unpack in the developer experience. Yeah. But we seem to be very successful in fast-growing startups for sure.
That's awesome to hear. I love that. Yeah, I'm always, I like this concept of lean DevOps, because people are like, they want to boil the ocean, right? Yeah. It's like, okay, we're starting. And I'm like, no. Like, calm. I'm like, pick one service, one little sliver. Avoid things that are massive. Like, don't do your user service. Don't use your cart service or your payment processing. Like, let's not get in the way of revenue. But take something that gets some traffic and pull that out. DevOps that, create this whole system around that, experiment with it, iterate. And then you have this like beautiful story with data to really share and apply to the rest of your, system. Yeah, I mean,
we spent a lot of time talking to a lot of different businesses and teams, and the thing that's become very apparent is like many teams work quite differently, and but there's certain things where we all just agree, like, we're gonna buy this out of the box thing, right? The all-in-one DevOps plugin, right? And it's like, that's great, because I think if you don't know DevOps, it's an easy way for the business to make a single investment and get started. But truthfully, like, there's just so much that's different about many teams, how even individual developers works, where I think you have to have a high degree of flexibility, and there's areas where you don't, like maybe a CI/CD pipeline is sort of, I think it's kind of just like table stakes now. It's just basically like vanilla computes that do a thing, right? But I think there's other areas where you get into, especially how other parts of the business interface with the technology and the disruption that creates for technology teams. So we see a lot of this, like, even expanding beyond the development team, where there's this continuous integration and continuous development model, to our point earlier about feature flagging, right? Like, now you're involving the sales team in your DevOps thinking, and that automation is valuable to them. We've seen the same thing with support. We've seen the same thing with data and analytics teams that are maybe doing more reporting things. So I think this is a really big thing to unpack, and it feels a lot more just like generally business process automation more and more and more, as the idea of like cloud computes become more commodity, and some of these DevOps technologies become more commodity. It gets more human, to your point, right? Where it's more about enabling the individual. And that's our hope, is that we can be part of that story.
I love that. That's very cool.
Hey, that's my pitch.
Yeah, it's a good one.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
So a couple other things as we're starting to get close to the end of the hour. One thing that I brought up before that maybe sounded scary was, how do you think about your daily workflow and some of the tools or best practices, productivity hacks?
How do you stay productive during a pandemic?
Yeah, you all like prep me with this, and then I was like, you're making a lot of assumptions. I mean, to be totally blunt, like, my capacity for excellence this year is half of what it was last year. Like, we are all under incredible strains and shifts in our just daily lives. I mean, like, I have a kid trying to manage all of this. It's challenging, to say the least. So right now my productivity looks a lot like a chicken running around on a farm. But I would say I am big on to-do lists. So like, I'm fairly old school with like pen and paper, and then like checking it off when it's done. So I know there's tons of tools, but paper works fine for me. Let's see what else. I mean, like the chat tools, I wouldn't be able to live without. Teams is massive, SharePoint in general, but also, just our average community stuff. It's usually in Discord or Slack. And so staying involved in all of that is important. But yeah, at this point, like, I'll take tips. Like, what have other people said?
That's interesting. Yeah, great question. I'd love to hear your experience around Discord. So this is something that's come up a couple times now as we've talked to people who are in the community space and development, and people are digging Discord in some ways for building communities. I use it for gaming. Never really saw the developer angle. What's your experience with Discord as far as how it's helpful and obviously different than Slack or Teams, respectfully, right?
Yeah, I mean, so far I've used it as a speaker, so being able to actually interact with everyone. So in that way, it's been really nice because we do have a less cozy, a less intimate, really, way of communicating right now. Like, I'm not in the same room with anyone. I can't, really read their whole experience and be there with them in that moment. And so it is a nice way of supplementing that and being able to engage despite it, being text.
The voice features that it has, you can sort of just jump in a room and have like a conversation with people. Which
is awesome.
Yeah. What about roles? I've heard roles is something that the community managers, community advocates really like because it kind of is a way to help represent sort of champions, I guess, is sort of in the program.
I haven't actually used it. I haven't run a Discord community, so I haven't come across that yet. But I mean, is that a way of like separating? So for example, if you're like a member versus a speaker versus an organizer, that kind of thing?
I've only seen it in the gaming context, and it's more usually like there's, a couple different roles and they have admins and they have mods, and it's more like for like streaming and these kinds of things. So I'm just generally curious how when people are building developer communities, because we obviously have a Slack community, you're a part of it. Thank you for joining. And like, we're constantly curious about how to foster more of that collaboration. Because it used to be IRC. That's when I started, right? And now there's like 3 different ways to do this, and which one's better? I don't know.
I don't know. I like to think of Slack as pretty IRC.
Yeah.
I think, it's tricky. There's also this element, maybe I'm alone, but I feel kind of tired of, so like we pivoted to online events, which is fantastic, like I'm glad we can still have them. But suddenly there's like 20 events every week and I'm just tired. It's like, how do we create this sort of sustainable online event space? And for me, Discord and the chat fits into that, where it's like, I want to engage with people, but I feel like I don't know, maybe I'm getting grumpy old Manny, but it's like, now we have to add another thing. Oh, I need Marco Polo now. Oh, I need TikTok now. Oh, I need Discord now.
Slack
like,
just added stories, I just heard yesterday during Slack Frontier, which is interesting. Tell us a little bit about your experience with Teams, because Teams is something that we haven't had a lot of exposure with, but we think obviously the integration of Teams, the amazing cloud pipelines with Azure, and sort of like I've even seen these cool terminal integrations that are very, very interesting. What's really standing out about Teams for you as far as the developer experience?
Teams is, for me, the best in its market of collaboration software. Okay. So like it is an incredibly powerful tool, not only for, video conferencing and chat, but also being able to share documents really quickly. So because it's, in SharePoint, so you can just plug right in and get all your, everything you need. It's right there. So it's this really strong collaboration tool. I think the chat, also powerful, but just different. So like, it's something that I had to get used to because I sort of came up on Slack. So it's like, I'm expecting it to be this. And Teams is a little bit different, but I love it. I'm in it every day. And honestly, it and Outlook run my life at this point. So I've just submitted.
Well, we'll have to reach out at some point to get some pointers on how we might integrate CTO.ai with Teams at some point, because we definitely talked to a lot of people who would love to see that happen, and we just have not prioritized it as of yet.
Yeah,
seems like a great opportunity.
I would love that. Yes, we should absolutely look into that.
Cool.
Well, I guess one other kind of we just have a few minutes left. Any other thoughts on just like the current state of DevOps and where it's going?
I think DevOps is in an interesting spot because it is mature, we should say, I guess. We're 10 years in. So now it's like, okay, we've been talking about this. it's widely adopted, but in different degrees almost. Like people, there's a lot of like, oh, I do the DevOps, but it's like, do you know what that means? And so really kind of like
it sounds kind of like a dance. Like I do the DevOps.
Yes, it's 100%. But yeah, so it's like this, how do you actually integrate these ideas in a really actionable, useful way for these teams, in a way that they actually get that feedback? They're like, this is working, you know? So I think that's going to be an interesting spot. How DevOps like fits in with SRE is interesting, site reliability engineering. Related, like I always think of it as DevOps covers the entire pipeline. And SRE really covers like a portion of that sort of software development pipeline, where you're looking at like availability, reliability, all the abilities. But I think it fits in, like how do we actually integrate in a way that's kind of seamless and get all our talking points in line. I don't know. I think it's going to be an interesting few years. I'm also curious how COVID impacts DevOps. I think, you know, you all probably see more frequently, but I think I've sensed a hesitation to take risks through this period, and a desire for more stability. And usually stability means fewer deployments. And so I think people have this sort of instinct to like, okay, hold the horses. Like, let's just stop the presses kind of situation. And convincing people that like, no, this is where DevOps can thrive in this type of environment. This is where it can be a strength, despite its sort of scary feeling. I think that's our next challenge.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think one of the biggest things we've seen with DevOps is not just during COVID, is not just sort of like a slightly more risk aversion, although people are still very much investing into supporting their teams, because you know it's a hard time. You gotta get more and less a lot of times during these circumstances. But we're also seeing a lot where people are just struggling around the shift to remote communication and just getting these ideas permeating and this knowledge permeating. And that's where, you know, we'd love to see a resurgence around some of the ideas that we tested out with ChatOps over the last 10 years, but it just never made sense before to justify that when you could just write a bash script and say, here, look over my shoulder, this is how it works, right? So I think that's a really interesting mindset shift, and I think we're starting to see some of it come out of, you know, whether it's Slack stories is the thing or not, right? But like the idea here is we're starting to get sensible about the idea that, you know, remote's not going anywhere. I think it accelerated that by, you know, 2 years or something, the shift to remote, right? So
yeah, totally agree. And I can't imagine, I think people will go back to offices, but not in the numbers, and I don't think not in the consistency. So I could see people going to an office 2 times a week rather than 5, you know, that kind of thing. So it will be interesting.
All right, well, we're just about out of time. Any last words? And where is your favorite place for people to find you online?
Probably the best place to find me online is Twitter. Yes, Twitter @editingemily. So yeah, that's the best spot to find me. Thank you so much for having me on here. It was so nice to just chat about DevOps. I'm really excited about where you all are taking your company. But yeah, I think just hang in there. We're all going through it. So it's like the thing I've been focused on is like, we talk about self-care, but there's also self-compassion, you know, like just giving yourself grace for where you're at any moment, and that's okay, and that we're all going to make it through this.
It's a great message.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. That's all we have for today. And remember to click subscribe and never miss out on any of the weekly videos, and we'll be back next week. Take us out, Kyle.
I will, and we'll link to that book too in the